Ladies and gentlemen, narcissism at its core is not merely arrogance or inflated self-esteem. It is a defense mechanism, a complex psychological construction built to protect a deeply fragile inner world. The narcissist operates through a system of delusion, not necessarily because they choose to lie, but because they must. Their entire identity is built around the avoidance of shame, inadequacy, and vulnerability. What they present to the world, and often to themselves, is not a reflection of truth, but a mask painstakingly crafted to survive in a world they secretly fear will reject the real them. This mask is upheld through control. Control of perception, control of narrative, control of others' reactions. Every interpersonal interaction becomes a tool to reaffirm a sense of superiority or indispensability. Praise is oxygen, criticism is poison. And so the narcissist filters reality, ignoring or distorting feedback that doesn't align with their internal mythology. This selective perception is not passive, it is active and often aggressive. People around them are unconsciously assigned roles: the admirer, the enabler, the opponent. These roles serve the narcissist's internal script. It is not a sustainable system, but it can endure, sometimes for years, through a process of subtle coercion and emotional manipulation. However, reality is not infinitely malleable. The world pushes back, and over time, the narcissist's delusion must wrestle with the truths that emerge outside their control. These truths can come in many forms. A partner finally leaves. An employee refuses to be manipulated. A child sets a boundary. A career opportunity collapses. Often it is not one catastrophic event that causes the collapse, but a series of small confrontations with reality, each one chipping away at the illusion. The narcissist typically responds with rage, blame, denial, or retreat. These responses may succeed temporarily, restoring a false sense of control, but each defense costs more energy and yields less comfort. Eventually, the mask fractures. That final moment, the moment the narcissist is truly broken, is often subtle from the outside, but seismic internally. It is not always accompanied by screaming or dramatic displays. Instead, it is marked by a terrifying realization. The world no longer conforms to their narrative, and no amount of charm, intimidation, or manipulation can restore it. Someone important has stopped playing their assigned role. A truth has been spoken and not withdrawn. An illusion has been named publicly. And in that moment, the narcissist faces something they have spent a lifetime avoiding: unfiltered truth. This truth is not abstract, it is personal and shattering. It might be as simple as the recognition: I am not who I claim to be. Or, they see me now and they're not afraid. It is a confrontation with powerlessness, with the limits of control, and with the reality that other people have their own agency. For someone who has lived in a self-generated myth of dominance and invulnerability, this realization is not just painful, it is existential. The psychological framework built to protect the narcissist begins to collapse under its own weight. Defense mechanisms, denial, projection, gaslighting no longer function effectively. The people around them no longer believe the narrative. The narcissist may attempt to double down, to reassert control, but it's too late. The confrontation with truth has already happened, and truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. It is in this moment that the potential for growth exists, but so does the risk of complete psychological fragmentation. For the narcissist to integrate this truth would require humility, remorse, and the willingness to rebuild the self from a foundation of authenticity rather than illusion. Few do. Most retreat further into bitterness, constructing a new narrative of victimhood or betrayal to explain their downfall. But for those rare individuals who face the truth fully, that breaking point becomes a beginning. It is the death of the false self and potentially the birth of a real one. But the point must be made clearly that confrontation with truth is not something we can impose upon another. It arises when the lies no longer work, when reality asserts itself with enough clarity and force that even the most defensive mind cannot maintain its illusions. It is a psychological reckoning, one that requires both external resistance and internal collapse. And though the process is painful and often tragic, it is also necessary, because no genuine change, no actual freedom can be found while one is enslaved to a delusion. The narcissistic personality structure is fundamentally relational. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It thrives and persists through its interaction with others. One of the key sustaining forces behind the narcissist's psychological framework is the absence of limits in their interpersonal environment. People around them, often unknowingly, allow boundaries to be crossed repeatedly in an effort to maintain peace, avoid conflict, or appease the narcissist's volatile emotional response. Over time, this dynamic gives the narcissist an inflated sense of entitlement and control, which reinforces the illusion that their behavior is acceptable, even justified. The longer this continues, the more deeply entrenched their false self becomes. Boundaries are not merely rules for behavior. They are declarations of personal reality. They communicate to others where one individual ends and another begins, mentally, emotionally, physically. In healthy relationships, these boundaries are respected, negotiated, and mutually honored. But for the narcissist, boundaries are often perceived as threats. They symbolize rejection, loss of control, and challenges to the narcissist's assumed superiority. When someone sets a firm boundary, they are effectively refusing to participate in the narcissist's constructed world. This refusal is not just a behavioral act, it is a psychological disavowal of the narcissist's entire framework. And this is precisely why such moments carry immense significance. The final moment, the breaking point, often arrives when someone the narcissist depends on finally and decisively enforces a boundary. This is not done with malice or revenge, but from a place of self-preservation, integrity, or maturity. And it is precisely this calm, firm refusal to continue playing the narcissist's game that makes it so disruptive. The narcissist is used to confrontation, often even welcomes it, because it allows them to assert dominance. What they are not prepared for is emotional disengagement, a person stepping out of the drama, refusing to argue, no longer trying to prove their point, simply withdrawing their participation. When a boundary is enforced and maintained, it disrupts the narcissist's psychological equilibrium. The person who once fed their ego with attention, praise, submission, or fear now becomes a mirror reflecting their limitations. This is intolerable to someone whose identity is dependent on external validation and control. The narcissist may respond with rage, manipulation, guilt-tripping, or attempts to reassert dominance. But the impact of the boundary is not in the narcissist's response, it is in the persistence of the person who holds it. The narcissist begins to realize, consciously or unconsciously, that their influence is waning. Their usual strategies are failing. This is profoundly destabilizing. In many ways, the enforcement of boundaries functions like a psychological intervention. It introduces the narcissist to a new reality, one in which they are not all-powerful, not universally adored or feared, not entitled to unquestioned loyalty. This new reality is not created by punishment, but by the absence of complicity. And it is this absence that breaks the illusion for the narcissist, who has spent a lifetime manipulating interpersonal dynamics to maintain a sense of control. Losing that control reveals a terrifying truth. They are not exempt from consequence. This moment can be especially powerful when it comes from someone the narcissist assumed was permanently under their influence. A partner, a child, a long-term friend, or employee. The shock of resistance from a familiar source often triggers a deeper crisis than criticism from an outsider. It challenges their assumptions about their own power. It reveals that people change, grow, and see through things. And perhaps most devastatingly, it shows that the narcissist is no longer needed in the same way, or perhaps never will. For the person enforcing the boundary, this act can be both liberating and painful. It often comes after years of emotional labor, confusion, and inner conflict. But it also marks the reclaiming of agency, the decision to prioritize one's own psychological well-being over the narcissist's demands. In doing so, they model a version of strength that the narcissist cannot replicate. A quiet, grounded refusal to be controlled. And in this strength, the narcissist sees what they lack. It is important to note that boundaries are not weapons. They are not about revenge or humiliation. They are about clarity. But to the narcissist who experiences any loss of control as an existential threat, even the most respectful boundary can feel like an attack. And in that perceived attack, the narcissist is often confronted with a level of internal chaos they have long denied. This confrontation is not always outwardly visible, but inwardly. Something significant is shifting. The structure they've depended on is cracking. Thus, the final moment of collapse for the narcissist often begins not with betrayal, but with a boundary. It is the moment someone stops participating in the fiction and starts living in truth. And in doing so, they don't just protect themselves. They expose the narcissist to a world they've spent their entire lives trying to avoid. One where people have the right to say no, to walk away, to choose something healthier. That moment is when the illusion starts to die. And that death is what breaks the narcissist. At the heart of narcissism lies a profound inner emptiness, one often masked by outward displays of confidence, superiority, or control. The narcissist does not function as a unified, authentic self, but rather operates from what many psychologists refer to as a false self, a fabricated identity constructed to gain approval, admiration, and dominance over others. This false self is not developed out of genuine self-awareness or personal integration. It is built out of necessity to survive early psychological wounds, typically rooted in environments where unconditional acceptance was absent or inconsistent. Over time, this external persona becomes the narcissist's primary way of relating to the world, while the true self, often fragile, ashamed, and deeply insecure, remains buried, unacknowledged, and the false self is dependent on constant external validation, praise, attention, admiration. These are not luxuries for the narcissist. They are psychological necessities. They function as the fuel that sustains the illusion of grandiosity and worthiness. The narcissist becomes skilled at creating circumstances and relationships that serve this purpose. Charm, manipulation, performance, and strategic emotional displays are used to elicit the responses they need to maintain their internal equilibrium. But this is an inherently unstable system because it depends entirely on external factors that cannot be perfectly controlled. People change, circumstances shift, and eventually the supply of validation begins to run dry. When this supply is interrupted, when admiration turns to critique, when control is lost, or when others stop playing along with the narcissist's demands, the entire false self is threatened. It is here that the collapse begins. What is most important to understand is that this collapse is not simply a loss of status or admiration. It is a psychological disintegration, because the narcissist has not cultivated a resilient, grounded internal identity. They have nothing substantial to fall back on when the outer construct fails. The true self, long suppressed and neglected, lacks the development needed to step in and absorb the impact. The narcissist is left psychologically unmoored. The moment the false self collapses is often accompanied by intense emotional responses: rage, despair, paranoia, or even dissociation can emerge. These reactions are not just expressions of frustration, they are indicators of a deep internal crisis. The narcissist experiences the collapse not as a setback, but as a kind of annihilation. Their identity, their sense of meaning and value was entirely tied to the image they projected and the control they exerted. Without those, they are confronted with an unbearable sense of inadequacy and emptiness. This is the psychological terrain they have spent years, sometimes decades, avoiding. In many cases, the collapse of the false self is triggered by a critical relational event: a partner leaving despite their manipulation, a child refusing contact, a workplace no longer tolerating toxic behavior. These are often the catalysts. But these events are not isolated incidents. They represent a cumulative breakdown. Over time, the narcissist has eroded the goodwill, trust, and emotional resources of those around them. What appears to them as sudden abandonment is in fact the long-term consequence of their own inability to form reciprocal, respectful relationships. When those relationships finally end, the narcissist is confronted not only with the loss of control, but with a terrifying recognition. They are alone, and they have contributed to their own isolation. What follows this collapse can go in one of two directions. The first is a deepening of pathology. The narcissist, unable or unwilling to face the truth of their condition, may retreat further into fantasy, blame others entirely, or attempt to quickly rebuild a new false self with different people. This is a form of psychological escape, a way to avoid the pain of self-confrontation. Unfortunately, this path often leads to repeated cycles of collapse, each more severe than the last. The second, though less common, path is one of potential transformation. If the narcissist is capable of tolerating the shame, grief, and loss that comes with the collapse, there is a chance for genuine healing. This would require a willingness to dismantle the false self, to acknowledge the wounds that gave rise to it, and to begin the difficult work of developing an authentic identity, one not based on domination or admiration, but on vulnerability, self-reflection, and relational honesty. And this process is neither fast nor easy. It often requires therapeutic intervention, emotional accountability, and a sustained commitment to change. But it is possible. The breaking of the false self, while devastating, can also serve as the beginning of psychological rebirth. Ultimately, the collapse of the narcissist's identity structure is a confrontation with truth. The truth that they are not immune to loss, not exempt from accountability, and not the center of others' lives. This truth, while profoundly painful, is also liberating. It presents an opportunity, not a guarantee, for the narcissist to begin again, this time grounded in what is real, not what is projected. Whether they seize that opportunity depends on their capacity for humility, introspection, and the courage to face the self they have long avoided. Narcissistic personality structures are not random or inexplicable. They are the result of psychological strategies formed over time, often rooted in childhood experiences where the individual felt emotionally unsafe, invalidated, or unseen. These strategies include the elevation of the self, the denial of vulnerability, and the projection of blame onto others. Over time, these defensive adaptations harden into a rigid personality structure. And like all psychological systems that are based on avoidance and distortion, they eventually encounter the force of reality. That moment when truth breaks through is not simply disruptive to the narcissist worldview. It is the moment when long avoided moral and emotional consequences come to collect their due. One of the most misunderstood aspects of narcissistic behavior is that it is not morally neutral. Narcissists, in the course of preserving their own grandiosity and controlling the perceptions of others, often manipulate, lie, exploit, and gaslight. These actions may not always be premeditated in a criminal sense, but they carry emotional consequences for the people around them. The narcissist's need to dominate often results in relationships that are one-sided and emotionally abusive. Partners are devalued, friends are used, and subordinates are belittled. Over time, this behavioral pattern accumulates a weight, a psychological and moral debt that must eventually be paid. The narcissist may believe they are exempt from consequence. For much of their life, they often are. Their charm, social intelligence, or ability to instill fear allows them to avoid accountability. When confronted, they deflect. When challenged, they attack. When questioned, they cast doubt on the questioner. This pattern creates a temporary illusion of invulnerability, one that reinforces their belief that they are above the rules that govern others. But no one lives in complete isolation from reality forever. People leave, institutions push back, and life introduces circumstances that cannot be controlled. And eventually, the narcissist finds themselves in a position where their usual tactics no longer work. This is where the concept of moral responsibility becomes crucial. The narcissist may have succeeded in avoiding blame through manipulation or intimidation, but they cannot avoid the internal consequences of their actions indefinitely. The psyche, especially one under strain from years of denial and distortion, begins to show signs of wear. The narcissist, whose behavior has alienated others and hollowed out relationships, eventually faces the truth of their isolation. They may find themselves surrounded only by those who fear them, tolerate them out of obligation, or have stopped engaging altogether. This isolation is not an accident. It is the inevitable result of years of neglecting the emotional needs and autonomy of others. What happens at this point is often misunderstood. The narcissist does not merely suffer because they are lonely. They suffer because their carefully constructed reality is falling apart, and with it, the illusion that they could live without consequence. The emotional toll of this realization can be profound. It includes shame, a feeling they are deeply unfamiliar with because they've spent years defending against it. It includes grief, not just for lost relationships, but for the recognition that much of their life has been spent performing rather than connecting. And it includes fear. Fear that they are fundamentally unworthy of the love and respect they once demanded. This breaking point is often triggered by an external event, but the most significant damage occurs internally. The narcissist begins to realize that their actions were not just ineffective or misjudged, but wrong. Not wrong in the sense of social faux pas, but wrong in a deeper ethical sense. They hurt people. They manipulated trust. They failed to care. This recognition, when it surfaces, is the most painful of all because it shatters the narrative of superiority and moral exemption that has defined their identity. It is in this moment that the moral debt comes due, not through punishment imposed by others, but through the weight of self-awareness, often for the first time in their lives. Yet, this confrontation with consequence can also be redemptive. If the narcissist chooses to engage honestly with this reckoning, they are presented with a rare opportunity, the chance to become morally responsible. This does not mean offering performative apologies or seeking sympathy. It means acknowledging harm, seeking understanding rather than control, and developing an inner life that is no longer dependent on domination or deception. It is a difficult path because it requires dismantling the very defenses that once kept them emotionally alive. But it is also the only path toward integration, the process by which they may become a whole person rather than a fragmented persona. The collapse of the narcissistic structure is not just a psychological event, it is a moral and existential one. The reckoning that breaks the narcissist is not random. It is the natural result of years of avoided responsibility, unmet obligations, and misused relational power. That final moment, when their strategies fail and the truth is revealed, is the place where genuine transformation becomes possible. But only if they are willing to accept that they are not the exception to the moral order. Like everyone else, they are accountable. And it is in that accountability that they might finally become real.